In this video, we will examine a disturbing pattern of crimes committed by those sworn to uphold the law. Former police officers. Trusted uniforms. Abused authority. From sexual assault and child exploitation to cold-blooded murder, these cases reveal how power can rot when left unchecked. This is not about mistakes in the line of duty. It is about betrayal, violence, and the consequences when accountability arrives too late. David Warren, State, Louisiana, 62 years old. He shot an unarmed man from a second-floor balcony during the chaos after Hurricane Katrina, and what followed exposed how quickly law enforcement can collapse when oversight disappears. David Warren was an officer with the New Orleans Police Department in the days after Hurricane Katrina devastated the city in 2005. New Orleans at that time was barely functioning. Floodwaters lingered. Power was gone. Communication failed. Police officers were stretched thin, operating with little supervision and enormous discretion. In that vacuum, the line between law enforcement and unchecked force blurred fast. Henry Glover was a civilian trying to survive in the aftermath. He was not armed. He was not attacking anyone. From a second-floor balcony, Warren fired his rifle and struck Glover. The shot did not kill him immediately. Glover was still alive, wounded and vulnerable, when officers encountered him afterward. Instead of medical care, what followed was neglect, obstruction, and concealment. Glover would later die. His body would not be recovered intact. It would be burned inside a car, eliminating evidence and erasing any immediate chance of accountability. For years, the truth stayed buried alongside the wreckage of Katrina. Witnesses were scattered. Records were incomplete. Local investigations went nowhere. It took a federal civil rights probe to bring the case back into focus. Prosecutors argued that Warren's actions were not split-second mistakes under pressure, but criminal violations of Henry Glover's constitutional rights. The case wasn't framed as a typical homicide. It was framed as an abuse of state power that directly caused a man's death. In 2011, a federal jury agreed. David Warren was convicted and sentenced to 25 years in prison. For a moment, it looked like accountability had finally reached one of the darkest corners of post-Katrina policing. On appeal, the conviction unraveled. The court found serious prosecutorial misconduct, including the withholding of evidence. In 2013, the verdict was overturned. Warren was acquitted. He walked free. For Henry Glover's family, the reversal felt like a second erasure. First, his life had been taken. Then, the legal system declared that no one would ultimately be held responsible. The technical failures of the trial outweighed the moral weight of the act. Legally, the case was closed. Emotionally, it never was. The impact of the Warren case reached far beyond one officer or one victim. It became a central example in federal investigations into the New Orleans Police Department, which later entered a consent decree requiring sweeping reforms. Training, supervision, use of force policies, and disaster response protocols were all scrutinized. The message was clear: emergencies amplify existing problems. They don't create them from scratch. David Warren's name remains tied to a question that still haunts disaster policing in America. When everything breaks down, who is watching the people with guns and badges? And what happens when the answer is no one? Johannes Mehserle, State, California, 43 years old. He fired a single shot into the back of a restrained man lying face down on a train platform, and that moment would change American conversations about police violence forever. Johannes Mehserle was a Bay Area rapid transit police officer in the late 2000s, a young officer working routine transit patrols across Northern California. BART policing was supposed to be low profile, crowd control, fare disputes, late-night disturbances. Oscar Grant III was unarmed. He was already detained. Video footage showed him pinned to the ground, lying prone, with officers standing over him. The situation was tense but controlled. Then Mehserle drew his weapon. In seconds, a gunshot rang out. Grant cried out. Blood spread across the concrete. He would later die from the wound. The official explanation came quickly. Mehserle claimed he had intended to deploy his taser, not his firearm. A mistake. A tragic accident. But the video told its own story. Multiple angles captured the moment, recorded by bystanders who did not look away. The footage spread fast, stripping the narrative of ambiguity. To many viewers, this was not confusion under pressure. It looked like force without necessity, power without restraint. The difference between what was said and what was seen ignited outrage that did not stay contained to Oakland. The legal process unfolded under intense public scrutiny. Mehserle was charged, but not with murder in the way many expected. Prosecutors pursued involuntary manslaughter, arguing negligence rather than intent. The jury ultimately agreed. He was acquitted of murder charges and convicted only on the lesser count. The sentence was 2 years in prison. He served 11 months. Then he was released. For many, that outcome felt disconnected from the gravity of the act. A life was lost. A family was shattered. Yet the punishment appeared brief, procedural, almost administrative. That disconnect became the core of the anger. The case wasn't just about Johannes Mehserle anymore. It was about how the justice system weighed the lives of black victims against the careers of police officers. The reaction was immediate and sustained. Protests erupted across Oakland and beyond. Some were peaceful. Others turned destructive. But beneath the chaos was a consistent message. This was not an isolated incident. The Mehserle case joined a growing list of names and videos that communities of color already carried in memory. It validated a fear many had lived with for years, that compliance did not guarantee survival. Johannes Mehserle did not pull the trigger in a vacuum. He acted within a system that trained him, armed him, and later shielded him with legal language. His conviction closed a courtroom chapter, but it opened a national one. The image of Oscar Grant on the platform remains a reference point, a reminder that one shot, fired in seconds, can echo for generations, reshaping how a country views law enforcement, accountability, and the cost of unchecked power. Dennis Perkins, State, Louisiana, 49 years old. He sensitively assaulted women, and even children, filmed them, and produced filth material involving minors, while serving as a senior law enforcement officer, sworn to protect the public. Dennis Perkins was a deputy sheriff in Livingston Parish, Louisiana, during the 2010s and early 2020s, a period when his reputation inside the department appeared stable, even respectable. Behind that surface, Perkins was committing crimes that extended over time and escalated in severity. The offenses were not impulsive. They were calculated. He assaulted adult victims. He recorded sensitive mistreatment involving children. He produced and stored child filth material, treating human suffering as something collectible. These were not isolated incidents. They formed a pattern of predation, hidden behind professional credibility and institutional silence. What made the case especially disturbing was how Perkins used his position to remain invisible. Law enforcement training gave him knowledge of investigative blind spots. Authority discouraged scrutiny. The same uniform that symbolized protection functioned as camouflage. Victims faced not just the trauma of abuse, but the added fear of reporting a high-ranking officer, someone embedded in the very system meant to respond. When the investigation finally surfaced, the volume and nature of evidence dismantled any narrative of misunderstanding or exaggeration. Digital files, videos, corroborated testimony. The case shifted rapidly from allegation to confirmation. Prosecutors described a sustained abuse of power, one that exploited both individual victims and the trust placed in law enforcement institutions. In 2023, the court imposed a sentence of 100 years in prison. The length of the sentence was deliberate. It reflected not only the number of crimes, but their scope, their cruelty, and the breach of public trust at their core. Perkins was removed permanently from society. No future parole calculations. No return to authority. The message was unambiguous. For the victims, the sentence did not undo the harm. Trauma does not expire with a verdict. Survivors were left with long-term psychological consequences, fear, distrust, fragmented memory, and the weight of knowing their abuser once held power over others as well. Still, the conviction offered something rare in cases involving police perpetrators: clear accountability. The community reaction was immediate and visceral. Livingston Parish residents expressed shock, anger, and betrayal. Parents questioned how someone capable of such crimes could advance within a department without detection. Attention turned inward. Hiring practices, background checks, supervisory oversight. How complaints were handled, who was protected, and why. The Perkins case triggered renewed scrutiny of how law enforcement agencies monitor their own. It exposed the danger of assuming authority equals integrity. In response, discussions intensified around mandatory reporting, psychological screening, digital evidence audits, and independent oversight, particularly in cases involving crimes against children. The realization was painful, but necessary. Predatory behavior does not announce itself, and rank does not prevent it. Dennis Perkins now exists only as an inmate number, stripped of the authority he abused. His case stands as a warning etched into the record. When institutions prioritize reputation over vigilance, predators find room to operate. And when that happens inside law enforcement, the damage extends far beyond individual victims. It corrodes trust at its source. Braulio Gonzalez, State, Florida, 51 years old. Braulio Gonzalez sexually assaulted two young sisters and used a firearm to threaten their silence, turning police authority into a tool of terror. He was a lieutenant with the Miami-Dade Police Department during the 2010s. A senior ranking officer entrusted with leadership, discipline, and judgment. The victims were two sisters, both children, between 8 and 10 years old. They were not strangers pulled into a random encounter. They were vulnerable, close, and young enough to understand fear before they could understand power. Gonzalez assaulted them and reinforced their silence with a gun. The threat was explicit. Obey or something worse happens. In those moments, the weapon was not just physical. It was psychological, a badge-backed warning that resistance would not be believed. The abuse did not come from chaos or impulse. It came from confidence. Gonzalez knew how authority worked. He understood how complaints against police officers were handled. He understood how doubt falls on victims, especially children, especially when the accused wears a uniform. That knowledge allowed the abuse to continue longer than it ever should have. Fear kept the victims quiet. Power kept him comfortable. When the case finally surfaced, the details were impossible to soften. Investigators uncovered testimony that showed clear coercion, deliberate intimidation, and repeated violations. The presence of a firearm elevated the crime beyond abuse into domination. Prosecutors emphasized not only the acts themselves, but the way Gonzalez leveraged his position to ensure compliance and silence. This was not a lapse in judgment. It was calculated exploitation. In 2022, the court delivered its sentence: life in prison. No ambiguity, no staggered terms. A recognition that crimes against children, committed under the authority of law enforcement, require permanent removal from power and society. The sentence reflected both the harm done and the breach of trust at the center of the case. For the sisters, the verdict marked a line between survival and justice, but it did not erase trauma. Childhood memories reshaped by fear do not reset when a courtroom empties. Healing became a long process, one defined by rebuilding safety where it had been violently taken. Their willingness to testify, however, shifted the balance. Their voices forced accountability where silence once protected the offender. The impact on the Miami-Dade Police Department was immediate and uncomfortable. Internal review processes came under scrutiny. How did a lieutenant, someone vetted, promoted, and trusted, escape detection? What warning signs were missed or ignored? The case exposed gaps in internal monitoring, especially regarding off-duty behavior, access to weapons, and complaints involving minors. In response, departments cited the Gonzalez case when expanding ethics training and child protection protocols. Emphasis increased on early reporting, mandatory escalation of allegations involving children, and independent oversight mechanisms that do not rely solely on internal chains of command. The case became a reference point in discussions about how authority can shield predators instead of stopping them. Gonzalez now lives out his sentence behind bars, stripped of rank, weapon, and control. His case stands as a warning written in permanence. When internal checks fail, the most vulnerable pay first, and when power goes unchallenged, it doesn't just corrupt, it preys. Michael Nealy, State, Florida, 54 years old. He beat and strangled his own police chief to death inside a hotel room, turning a long simmering internal conflict into homicide. Michael Nealy served as an officer with the Manford Police Department during the 2010s, working in a small agency where rank, proximity, and personality clashes carried outsized weight. Manford was not a big city department with layers of insulation. In 2019, the tension followed both men to a hotel. What began as a closed-door encounter ended in violence. Investigators determined that Nealy attacked Miller, beating him and then strangling him until he stopped breathing. The investigation moved quickly, but carefully. Detectives treated the scene as a homicide from the outset, securing the room and documenting signs of a violent struggle. Medical findings confirmed the cause of death as strangulation, supported by blunt force injuries consistent with an assault. The absence of a defensive narrative, no evidence of a lawful use of force, no indication of self-defense, narrowed the focus fast. Attention turned to Nealy almost immediately. His presence at the hotel, his known conflict with Miller, and witness timelines placed him at the center of the case. Investigators conducted interviews, reviewed phone records, and reconstructed the hours leading up to the killing. The picture that emerged was not one of a sudden, unforeseeable explosion, but of a confrontation fueled by accumulated resentment and unchecked stress. Nealy was arrested without incident. There was no manhunt, no standoff. The process was procedural, almost clinical, underscoring the shock of the crime itself. A police officer, taken into custody by fellow officers for killing the chief. The symbolism was impossible to ignore. The badge that once gave him authority now offered no protection at all. During trial, prosecutors emphasized motive through pattern rather than spectacle. They outlined the deteriorating professional relationship, the power dynamics at play, and the absence of any lawful justification for the violence. The defense attempted to frame the incident through stress and emotional collapse, but the facts remained blunt. Miller was beaten and strangled. He did not survive. Nealy caused it. In 2021, the verdict came down second-degree murder. The sentence was life in prison. Not a term measured in years, but an end to freedom. The court acknowledged the severity of killing a fellow officer, especially a superior, and the broader implications for public trust. This was not just a personal crime. It was an institutional rupture. The impact rippled through law enforcement circles. Departments across Oklahoma and beyond revisited how internal conflicts are managed, particularly in small agencies where lines between professional and personal blur easily. Questions surfaced about mental health screening, peer intervention, and whether warning signs had been missed or minimized because they involved familiar faces. Psychologically, the case exposed a dangerous blind spot. Police culture often emphasizes external threats while underestimating internal ones. Stress, resentment, and ego can fester behind professionalism until they erupt. Nealy's crime demonstrated that violence doesn't always come from the street. Sometimes it comes from the locker room, the briefing room, the closed door no one wants to open. Michael Nealy now lives out his life in prison, removed permanently from the profession he once served. The death of Lucky Miller left a void not only in a department, but in the assumption that shared badges guarantee shared restraint. The case stands as a stark warning. When internal conflict goes unaddressed, the consequences can be fatal. DeShawn Torrence, State, California, 41 years old. DeShawn Torrence sexually assaulted 4 women while on duty, using a patrol badge and police authority as the weapon that made escape impossible. He used traffic stops and calls for help as opportunities to sexually assault women who believed they were under police protection. He was a police officer in Sanger, California, in the early 2020s, a period when departments were already under public pressure to rebuild trust. Sanger was not a big city. The women he targeted were not random strangers in dark alleys. They were civilians encountered during legitimate police interactions. Traffic stops, welfare checks, moments when flashing lights signaled authority and safety at the same time. Torrence separated them from public view, then crossed lines that were absolute. 4 women, 4 separate assaults, each one tied directly to his role as an on-duty officer. What made the crimes especially difficult to uncover was how plausible his authority made everything appear. Victims hesitated to report what happened. Some feared retaliation. Others doubted they would be believed. The power imbalance was total. Torrence had a badge, a gun, and the benefit of institutional credibility. The women had only their accounts, and the knowledge that accusing a police officer often comes with consequences. In court, the focus stayed on consent, or rather the impossibility of it under those conditions. When a woman is detained, questioned, or dependent on an officer's discretion, the law recognizes that choice is compromised. The jury accepted that framing. In 2025, Torrence was convicted and sentenced to 5 consecutive life terms. No parole calculations, no ambiguity. The sentence ensured he would never again operate under color of law or outside a prison. For the victims, the verdict offered something rare in cases involving police sexual abuse validation. Their accounts were not minimized or reframed as misunderstandings. The court named the acts for what they were: rape committed through authority, violence disguised as procedure. While no sentence could undo the harm, the ruling publicly shifted the shame back where it belonged. The broader impact of the case reached far beyond Sanger. It reignited scrutiny over how police departments handle sexual misconduct allegations internally. Many agencies rely on complaints to surface abuse, but Torrance's case showed how ineffective that can be when victims fear the institution itself. In response, departments began revisiting body camera policies, supervisor ride-along requirements, and mandatory reporting protocols for any off-camera interactions with detainees. Charles Becker, State, New York, 45 years old. He used his police badge to protect a criminal empire, and then ordered a murder when that empire was threatened. Charles Becker rose through the New York Police Department at the start of the 20th century, a time when the city's politics and its underworld were tightly intertwined. His authority gave him access to the city's gambling dens and brothels, places officially illegal, but quietly tolerated. Becker didn't shut them down. He taxed them. Weekly payments flowed upward in exchange for protection from raids and arrests. The system wasn't subtle. It was routine. Everyone involved knew how it worked, and Becker was one of the men enforcing it with a badge in one hand and an open palm in the other. Herman Rosenthal disrupted that arrangement. A gambler and club owner himself, Rosenthal began talking. He threatened to expose police corruption, naming Becker and others publicly. In a city built on unspoken rules, Rosenthal broke the most dangerous one. He refused to stay quiet. For Becker, this wasn't just embarrassing. It was existential. Exposure meant collapse, not only of his income, but of the entire protection network that kept him powerful. In July 1912, Rosenthal was gunned down outside the Hotel Metropole, shot repeatedly in public view. The killing was fast, violent, and unmistakably deliberate. 4 gunmen were arrested almost immediately. What followed shocked New York. The shooters named Becker as the man who ordered the hit. A police lieutenant, accused of orchestrating a contract killing to silence a witness. Becker denied everything. He leaned on his uniform, his rank, and his political connections. The first trial ended in conviction, but the verdict was overturned on appeal due to legal errors. For a moment, it looked like the system might save one of its own. But the second trial told a different story. Witnesses held. Evidence tightened. The narrative of a corrupt officer who believed himself untouchable became impossible to ignore. In 1915, Charles Becker was convicted of first-degree murder. The sentence was death. He was executed in the electric chair at Sing Sing prison, the first NYPD officer in history to be put to death for murder. The image was unavoidable. A man once sworn to uphold the law dying by the state's hand for violating it in the most absolute way. The impact of Becker's downfall went far beyond his execution. It ripped open the facade of respectability surrounding the NYPD and exposed corruption as systemic rather than incidental. The case forced reforms, investigations, and a public reckoning with how deeply organized crime had embedded itself within law enforcement. Becker wasn't portrayed as a lone villain. He was proof of a structure that rewarded loyalty over legality. Charles Becker's execution closed a chapter in New York's criminal history, but its lesson endured. When corruption becomes normalized, violence becomes administrative. And when power goes unchecked long enough, it eventually demands a body to prove it still exists. Joe D. White, State, South Carolina, 52 years old. Joe D. White abused 3 teenage boys while wearing a police uniform and carrying the authority of the state. He was a small-town cop in Duncan, South Carolina, in the early 2000s. Not a celebrity officer, not a headline name at first, just another local badge. That's what made the first reports hard to believe. 3 teenage boys, all minors, all separate encounters. Same pattern, same uniform, same authority. Each boy described being isolated during what were supposed to be legitimate police interactions. No dark alley, no masked stranger, just a marked officer, on duty, controlling the situation. White didn't need to threaten. The badge did that for him. He used proximity, silence, confusion. He crossed the line deliberately, knowing the power imbalance made resistance unlikely and disclosure terrifying. What kept the abuse going wasn't just his actions. It was the environment. Small towns don't expect monsters in uniform. Kids hesitate. Parents doubt. Communities rationalize. Maybe it was a misunderstanding. Maybe the boys were exaggerating. That hesitation gave White time. Time to repeat the behavior. Time to assume he was untouchable. This is where authority becomes camouflage. When trust is automatic, predators don't have to hide very hard. Eventually, the stories aligned too closely to ignore. Investigators noticed the overlap. Same officer, same circumstances, Same age group. The wall cracked. White didn't fight it long. He pled guilty. 3 counts of lewd acts with children. 1 count of misconduct in office. No dramatic trial. No grand defense. Just admissions on the record. The court sentenced him to 15 years in prison, with all sentences running concurrently. On paper, it looked like accountability. In reality, it was a quiet ending to something deeply violent. But the damage didn't end with the sentencing. It never does in cases like this. The boys carried it forward. So did their families. There's a specific kind of trauma that comes from being abused by someone society tells you is safe. It rewires how authority feels. Police cars don't signal help anymore. Uniforms don't calm fear. For these victims, the justice system was both the site of the crime and the place they were expected to seek relief. That contradiction leaves scars courts can't measure. From a broader view, the case forced uncomfortable questions onto the department and the community. How much access did White have to minors while on duty? Where was supervision? Were there warning signs dismissed as personality issues or rumors? The record didn't show prior convictions, but that absence became part of the problem. Clean files can create false confidence. Predators often exploit exactly that gap, the space between reputation and reality. The outrage that followed wasn't loud, but it was persistent. Policy reviews, internal discussions, calls for stricter oversight when officers interact with juveniles. Some changes came slowly. More documentation, more training, more emphasis on boundaries. But reforms always arrive after harm, not before. The system reacted because it had to, not because it foresaw the risk. This is the core danger of cases like Joe D. White's. Not just the acts themselves, but the structure that made them possible. Power plus isolation plus trust equals opportunity. When those elements align, abuse doesn't need force. It only needs permission, implied, unspoken, and rarely questioned. White didn't invent that structure. He stepped into it and used it. If there's a lesson prosecutors point to in cases like this, it's not about demonizing all police. It's about acknowledging vulnerability. Children are uniquely exposed in encounters with law enforcement. They're taught obedience first, critical thinking later. That imbalance demands safeguards stronger than personal integrity alone. Systems cannot rely on trust as a control mechanism. Trust has to be paired with verification. 15 years in prison closed Joe D. White's chapter as an officer. It didn't restore what was taken. It didn't undo the fear, the silence, or the confusion those boys carried into adulthood. What it did was leave a record, a warning written in court transcripts instead of policy manuals. When authority goes unchecked, harm doesn't announce itself loudly. It happens quietly, repeatedly, until someone finally listens. These cases end in prison sentences, executions, or public disgrace, but the damage does not end there. Trust is harder to rebuild than it is to destroy. Each story leaves behind victims, families, and communities forced to question the badge itself. The lesson is blunt and uncomfortable: authority does not equal integrity. Without oversight, even those meant to protect can become the most dangerous threat of all.